I'm going to lead this video with what would typically be reserved for the end. I've chosen to do this because I believe it is something people, especially Aikido people, need to hear. Here it is. Tradition is not a synonym for preservation. Let me emphasize that again. Tradition is not a synonym for preservation. I am telling you this as someone who staunchly identifies as a traditional martial artist. I see myself as very much a product of and surrounded by tradition, and I don't view that as a bad thing. The rest of this video is going to be unraveling these concepts, but I just wanted to very clearly hammer home the axis around which the next few minutes is going to revolve. First, I want to lead with a bit of context. I've spent a lot of time on this channel sort of breaking down the way Aikido is viewed from outside of the art proper. The conclusion I've ultimately reached in regard to that is yes, the criticisms of Aikido are indeed valid, but a lot of the noise online comes from people who probably don't train anything, don't train much, or are frankly just deeply understudied on these kinds of topics. But I also don't really blame that crowd for it, because at the end of the day, were Aikido better managed and upkept, that noise would just die down. While there are problems with external, popular analysis of Aikido, blaming the whole world for Aikido's current situation is, frankly, juvenile. It stinks of something a teen in early puberty might say. It isn't my fault, it's the world's. If that is the premise we start with, it actually isn't any wonder why people poke so much fun at Aikido, because it only takes a few shreds of honesty to understand the insanity of that idea. So sure, the noise from outside the art is annoying, and it's easy to fall into the trap of pointing at it and loudly exclaiming that they just don't get it. To a certain extent, that is even true. No one understands a thing they don't study, but it's also immensely counterproductive. It's swimming against the rapids for no real purpose. In my view, compared to the outside criticism of Aikido, the art has been damaged 10 times over by the people still in it. This video was largely inspired by a series of articles and events that I've just happened across over the last few weeks. I won't be posting much about them specifically because I'm not really trying to start beef with anyone, so I'm keeping it relatively anonymous, but I do want to describe to you 2 examples from this grouping. The first was a discussion between several Aikido people of a certain style on a certain forum. In recent times, they begrudgingly have broken with the mainline organization of that style because it fundamentally mistreated or let down those within said organization. In response to this falling out, these Aikido people have devised that the best course of action is to create their own centralized organization. To my knowledge, this has not yet been formalized, but it appears to be the basic vector. The second example was an article that opened with an acknowledgement of some of that outside noise I mentioned earlier that Aikido is popularly seen as ineffective. The article goes on to conclude that the antidote to this problem is to quote-unquote get back to what the founder was doing, to get back to tradition. The answer is a return to form. Now, I want to make clear that neither of these incidents are all that isolated. It is very common to see this type of thing happen in Aikido spaces. It is almost ubiquitous, in fact. But I hope you've picked up on the commonality here. In both cases, someone correctly identifies that there is a problem and that something needs to change. Yet then, bafflingly, they make a 180-degree turn and argue that the solution is the same thing they've always done. If you want to find the cancer in Aikido, look no further than this. In an effort to be charitable to people that think along these lines, I know that most Japanese people envision their practice similarly. They see tradition as something that is fundamentally about preservation. This even extends into Japanese culture proper. And please don't misunderstand me. This video is not a crusade on tradition in general. In fact, I think the West largely undervalues tradition as a source for social trust and group cohesion. Similarly, the West often tends to label any change as somehow progressive, completely disregarding the fact that not all changes are good ones. But at the end of the day, tradition is not preservation, at least not in the sense most people seem to believe. I'm going to give you a hypothetical here that is very silly, but I hope will drive my point home a bit. In Japan, people bow a lot. I'm not going to get into the minutia here about everything that goes into that historically and culturally, but fundamentally, it is about politeness. Let's say, hypothetically, a subculture of Japanese people abolishes the bow and replaces it with putting their hands on their head as a greeting. I know this sounds funny, goofy, hilarious, whatever, but what I want you to consider is whether or not traditional Japanese culture in this example has been destroyed or preserved. For many, I think they would say that the removal of the bow is a severe blow to Japanese culture in this subgroup. That perhaps it could even be interpreted as anti-Japanese if you really want to pen an ideological undertone stint to it. But in reality, tradition here remains in continuity. The placing of one's hands on their head still denotes politeness without physical contact in all the same instances the people would just use a bow for. Only the external form has changed, but the essence, the core idea, what makes it Japanese in many respects, remains preserved. I opened this video by pointing out that I am a traditional martial artist through and through. The key point is that I understand that tradition is not static. It is on a continuum. Traditions change. They get invented, get reinterpreted, and remixed all the time. This doesn't make them any less traditional because they grow out of the same socio-cultural soil as everything else. I've had people over the years, for example, tell me that my Aikido is quote-unquote not real Aikido. And fine, maybe it isn't in your eyes, but what they cannot argue, factually, it's impossible to argue, that my Aikido has not grown out of the Aikido tradition. Tradition isn't static. If it is, then it's dead. What I have learned comes from Aikido. You might not think of it as Aikido. That's your prerogative, but at the end of the day, I am part of the Aikido tradition. But I want to keep scratching at this idea here. A common response to my position is that there are only so many ways to throw someone or something along those lines, and the premise being that what was good in the past is still good, therefore we should get back to it. In a vacuum, sure, this argument functions well enough. Indeed, the human body hasn't grown new limbs in the last few centuries, but in some ways, this premise is also puddle profundity, because it's context that matters. Let me use another analogy. Let's say a house is built in 1850, and it is preserved perfectly until today. Would you want to live in that house? Probably not. It has no electricity, no internet, possibly no running water. Its insulation might be a bit weak, all alongside other issues that our modern sentiments would find inconvenient at best. Beyond that, houses don't get built in some perfectly static pocket dimension. The land itself, perhaps, has changed. Maybe a coastline is getting worryingly close to the property in recent decades. Perhaps there is a political dimension to all of this. Maybe new laws dictate that the structure needs to be renovated to bring it up to date with earthquake code, and all of this assumes the owner has tried his damnedest to keep everything precisely the same. The reality is that the foundations have probably needed fixed, and it just wasn't possible to source the original materials or use the original techniques. So the foundation was fixed with very modern methods, causing a break in perceived tradition. Maybe one owner decided he really needed a garage to park his cars in, so he had one attached to the home. I could go on and on here. The fact of the matter is that yes, the house is still a house, and you could technically still live in it, but not without great sacrifice and still having to occasionally be quote-unquote untraditional. Martial arts are very similar. The human body is indeed the same that it was when Aikido was founded. Humanity, culture, popular belief, media, and politics, however, are not. Just take, for example, that the average Japanese person's idea of what a real fight was in 1920 is vastly different to that same concept in the imaginations of someone in 2024. Even if the modern everyman isn't very good at them, you should still probably expect someone to try and shoot in on your legs, because popular media has taught people that this is what a quote-unquote real fight looks like. It's what they quote-unquote should do. But this was absent 100 years ago. Another analogy here might be chess. All the pieces and rules are essentially the same as they have been for centuries, yet the game has changed. Online chess platforms as well mean that more people today than ever before have some vague competency at the game of chess. Maybe they aren't spectacular at it, but they know enough to be dangerous if you underestimate them. All of this is to say that traditions are on a continuum. The idea that we somehow need to double down on what people were doing in 1925 to manifest positive martial change in Aikido is absurdist fantasy. The largest problem facing modern Aikido today is the Schrodinger's Aikido person, who wants Aikido to be this martial, effective, popular, powerful practice, but refuses to change or innovate. I've often received criticism on some of my other videos in which I proposed rules or other ideas more generally, and the criticism goes something along the lines of that they are pedantic reinventions of the wheel, like, oh my god, Tengu just trained Tamiki Aikido, we already do all this stuff. But I want to point out here that Judo was a reinvention of the wheel. Yes, it added some things, important things even, but it was really just a new coat of paint on mostly old ideas in order to court a public that was actively leaving those traditions behind. BJJ, likewise, is a reinvention of the wheel. It is in many ways just early 1900s judo. It, too, has added things, to be sure, but the vast majority of what BJJ is simply reinvention. Yet judo vastly outcompeted traditional jiu-jitsu in the 1900s. And in America, BJJ is vastly outcompeting judo. And for the people who are saying that I've reinvented the wheel just due to Tamiki Aikido or wherever, where is it? Where is Tamiki Aikido? Where is its success? Why isn't it all over the place? It's because it's not speaking to people. Look, I'm a history guy at heart, so it does irritate my synapses a bit when a BJJ person comes out claiming that their art is this fresh, new, constantly innovating idea when it's demonstrably based on historical stuff. But even so, the reinvention has clearly been successful. BJJ is speaking not to the people of 1920 or 1950, but to the people of 2024. Sometimes you need to reinvent the wheel. I think the key there is to also acknowledge that it is just another iteration in a long line of tradition. To be honest with you, I think I'm pretty charitable when it comes to my vision for Aikido in the future. I'm not out to destroy the aesthetics-first style that seems to currently monopolize the art, nor am I against traditional Aikido in the sense that if you want to preserve it as a kind of museum piece, knock yourself out. I'll be the first to tell you that I read Aikido history and look at tons of old manuals and film from so many different martial arts, but I use those materials as inspiration, not as prescription. The ideas I develop from old material are proverbial step one. Petty imitation as an end unto itself is intellectually beneath us and creatively bankrupt. Imitation of your teacher is some beginner shit. And don't get me wrong, beginners should be imitating. But I know of people with absurdly high rank in various styles who are still just trying to be their teacher. That adds nothing new. And proclaiming it traditional is like, it's not traditional. It's just stasis. It's stagnation. If you want to look at the past, then use it to motivate you, to inspire you, to get the creative juices going. But don't just copy. My vision for Aikido is, in fact, a rare case of getting to have your cake and eat it too. I'd gladly, personally, teach the aesthetics-based Aikido in my dojo right before the martial stuff. I am on record saying this, and I don't think I'm going to reverse that opinion. Why? Because first off, I think it's fun. But second, an aesthetics-based Aikido that accepts what it is unbound by martial restraints. It can be even more demanding in terms of fitness. We can add body weight control. We can get real fun with it and creative. It can still be a valid form of exercise for maybe people who don't want to do the martial stuff, and that's fine. We should serve those people. And then, yes, I would teach the martial stuff right afterwards. But again, being honest with what it is, it's not going to look like demonstration Aikido, and it's not going to look like Ueshiba's Aikido, which is a good thing, by the way. We're going to address things like underhooks and overhooks and people shooting in on our legs, and we're going to spar. And I wouldn't even be opposed to having people work with me who are interested in that pure preservation, or who are interested in completely renovating the weapons junk. To me, that is all Aikido. It all grows from the same essence. But we can't have that future if people aren't willing to embrace change. People must stop this incessant obsession with doing the same thing to resolve problems. It's strange, it lacks creativity, and it isn't really traditional. Most importantly, it's just demonstrably ineffective. More on the point of it not being traditional, I do want to make a final point here. Find me the quote, the documentation, the source of a founder, any martial arts founder, demanding his art be practiced exactly the same by everyone for generations to come. Find me that document that proves that preservation was ever, always the core tenet of a founder, any founder. Even if you could find such a statement, it would be inherently hypocritical. A martial arts founder is implicitly breaking from a history of preservation because his founding of a new art is an open rejection of the past. It is breaking away. But more to the point, I've read a lot of martial arts history, and I've found far, far more founders who modify their style for specific students than those who try to force their views unilaterally down everyone's throats. While he isn't an Aikido person, Dong Haichuan of Baguazhang famously taught two of his first-generation students a bagua that emphasized their pre-existing skills. One learned a striking heavy bagua, and the other a wrestling heavy bagua, and it was still all Baguazhang. There is no reason why Aikido should not be the same. In fact, I have come to expect these differences. While I do accept that there will be similarities between my Aikido and other people's, perhaps even a majority of what we do will be similar, I'd almost be a little grossed out to find a carbon copy of myself in another person's practice. Again, sure, beginners should be focusing on imitation, on basics, but if you introduce yourself as so-and-so third-degree black belt and your Aikido looks exactly like your teacher's, I'm quietly regarding your training as a failure. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, but objectively, you are not your teacher. You are not the founder. Why are we chasing pale ineffective, unoriginal, empty imitation. Few things get my blood pressure up like this. To wrap this video up, I want to address something that has come up in my comments from time to time, and that is that I'm just going to be forced to eventually start my own dojo and perhaps even my own style. Frankly, I am very begrudgingly coming around to that idea, even though I certainly don't have the resources for it right now. But I want to be clear that I really don't want to do it. I identify one of Aikido's earliest errors as sending its brightest sons into exile. I frequently imagine a timeline where Shioda and Tamiki and Mochizuki and so many more never left the Aikikai, a timeline where their ideas were allowed to mature under a singular banner, and although they would be regarded as having different styles, Aikido would still benefit from its unity. Instead, the Aikikai decided to turn to the founder into a mere brand, closing the marketplace of ideas and interpretation in favor of a centrally controlled church of Ueshiba. Personally, I view this as being the turning point for Aikido. Yes, the seeds were always in place for Aikido to turn into a demonstration-focused style, but with the right people in the art, that could have been combated, mitigated, or at least alternative paths explored. But the many institutional schisms in Aikido are, to me, what truly shut the door for good. It turned from a possibility into an inevitability, into a prophecy. It was self-imposed brain drain. I really don't want to repeat that mistake. I want Aikido to have what I am willing to give it, because ultimately I am a product of Aikido itself. But I increasingly am met with an Aikido that is disinterested in course correcting, or expanding, or even introspection. It's a self-obsessed Aikido that wants to change, but simultaneously wants to remain exactly the same for reasons beyond my comprehension. Unfortunately, and I do mean this with great bitterness, there might be a need for a break from Aikido simply because it can't help itself but create disenfranchised orphans. And I'll be honest with you, it sucks. It injures me. I don't like it. I'm glad that people are out there experimenting with Aikido techniques, but it saddens me that it's BJJ guys and amateur MMA people who are broadly carrying the flag when it should be and could be Aikido people proper. Don't take this last section of the video to mean that a Tengu school is coming soon. It isn't. Although I'd love to one day have one here in Japan, complete with accommodations for visitors. But you can take this to mean that I think, despite hating it on a molecular level, that there also isn't much way forward except breaking with Aikido. And I know it's hard to express things authentically across the internet, but I really do want to drive home again that it does pain me to come to this conclusion. It isn't what I want for the art. I think it is a pity and very sad. But you can't help someone or something that refuses to be helped. To end this video, I want to say a few things. If you still feel the get back to the 1920s as a way forward for Aikido, I cannot suggest enough to you the following materials. Ellis Amdur's Duelling with Sensei and Hidden in Plain Sight are an excellent introduction. Christopher Lee's Sangenkai blog and the corresponding Facebook page do much to dispel the branding mythology of Sensei. Peter Goldsberry has something of a magnum opus called Transmission, Inheritance, and Emulation. It is a bit of a tougher read, but well worth it. It can be found on the AikiWeb forums and, I believe, on Aikido Journal. In that vein, Aikido Journal has several articles, but most influential among them, I believe, are the ones that detail in no statistical ambiguity the decline of Aikido. Their data is very straightforward and easy to understand, and it's something I cite regularly on this channel. I would also direct you towards the book Mirror of Modernity, Invented Traditions of Japan. This volume is part of a much larger body of work on invented traditions more generally. However, Paul Bowman, for example, has built on the concept in relation to martial arts more specifically, and his books, The Invention of Martial Arts, Popular Culture Between Asia and America, and Mythologies of Martial Arts. Finally, I would recommend the piece Safeguarding Authenticity versus Innovative Development, Methods of Protecting Traditional Chinese Martial Arts, found over on the Martial Arts Studies Academic Journal, which is a fantastic resource more generally. There will be links in the description as available, although I will try to produce this list in its entirety, even for books that aren't readily available online for free. If you can consume that entire body of work and still bend yourself into the pretzel so that you can come to the conclusion that what we need to do is just go back in time to the early days, then I really don't know what to tell you. We've reached a fundamental disagreement because the evidence is right in front of you. The literature is very clear that the so-called tradition that so many imagine isn't what most people think it is. Likewise, the historical trend of Aikido as an institution is very clear that it is, perhaps ironically, deeply inflexible to change or expansion. Finally, all this demonstrates that tradition is a living continuum, open to interpretation and iteration without violating the original essence. If you are still holding on to that pearly, white, illusionary dream of just becoming another Sensei, of getting back to some strange golden age that may or may not have never existed, but certainly will not be recreated today, then all I have left to say to you is a quote from Sean Connery from The Last Crusade. Let it go, Indiana. Let it go. And so we will end where we began. Tradition is not a synonym for preservation. Tradition is alive. It flows and changes shape. It may or may not come from the past, but it is only given power and meaning by those of us in the present for whom tradition must serve. Tradition without function, tradition without service, is needless and antiquated. Perhaps it would make an interesting museum exhibit, but it has as little bearing on us today as the dietary habits of a mammoth. Japanese people don't bow to one another because they always have, even if some might say that's the reason. They don't do it because that is how their ancestors did it either. Japanese people bow to one another because it means something, because it serves a communicative purpose as much today as it did 5 centuries ago and beyond. The bow as a social tool is still functional and relevant and, dare I say, modern, even if it is simultaneously deeply traditional. We should expect the same, and we can have the same, of our martial arts. It is for this reason that I very much identify as a traditional martial artist, but it isn't because I vacantly recreate the echoes of a bygone era in my practice, but because tradition inspires me to innovate. It inspires me to find modern function in traditional form, even if that form requires some modification. But this takes effort, study, and creativity. It takes sincerity, too. It isn't easy or comfortable. It's as much intellectual as it is physical in terms of what it demands. It is challenging. I would invite my audience to find function in tradition, to find service in it, to use tradition as a starting point to invent, reinvent, and collaborate, because fundamentally, tradition is about creating that intercultural social trust. It's about binding people together so we can leave the front door unlocked at night, or in martial arts terms, so that we can understand we are on the same path while still contending with the fact that we are individuals with our own specific aims. This is why I find it so disgustingly perverse that tradition is often used as a weapon to divide people, to establish cults of wishy-washy history and questionable personality. Tradition can be functional, and tradition is malleable within certain parameters. We must start seeing it that way. Traditional martial arts must serve modern people in a clear and obvious way. And if this sounds like I'm rehashing the same realization that revolutionized Japanese martial arts during the Budo movement of last century, damn, you've caught me being traditional. Anyway, that's all from me for now. I want to thank everyone for watching and listening. I know this was almost a rant, but trust me, a lot of thought went into writing it. As for some housekeeping things, even during this minor posting hiatus, the channel has inexplicably continued to grow a little bit, and I'm deeply thankful for that. I hope to get back on schedule again very soon, and I have a few more projects that I'm pretty excited about in the pipeline, so look forward to those. At any rate, thank you so much for the continued support. There is no Tengu channel without you guys, and none of my future projects would amount to anything without your support. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace.